I woke before the street lights clicked off, the way my body still kept the hours of a school librarian even in retirement. The house held that thin blue hush you only get before the desert sun remembers its job. I filled the kettle and chose the chipped mug with the hairline crack that looks like a river delta. My husband Walter found it at a church rummage sale the year we eloped. He said everything useful deserved a second life. Steam ghosted the kitchen window while the kettle fussed. Beyond the glass, the Washoe Valley sky lifted into a bruised pink and the mountains wore their usual band of morning shadow. On the sill, 3 stubborn jade plants leaned toward the light. Walter used to say not to drown them, they like a stingy hand. I watered each with a teaspoon, wiped the soil off the saucer with the cuff of my robe, and told him quietly, "Good morning." I still talk to him. It turns out, you can be a widow and a wife at once. The ritual keeps the corners of the day from fraying. Toast quince jam, a sweep of the kitchen floor, 10 orderly minutes with the newspaper folded into quarters, so it lies flat, my small rebellion against crumple and mess. I am Evelyn Hart, 68, retired after 3 decades of shelving, shushing teaching children to sound out the world. The house on Juniper Lane has been my slow heartbeat since the year we could finally afford it. Every room holds a remark from our life together, the crooked bookshelf Walter swore had character. The dining table we sanded until our palms were tender, the dent in the hallway, where he once misjudged the piano bench and laughed so hard he couldn't breathe. There are pencil marks on the pantry door, a ladder of dates and inches, Nora's name scrawled in 3 different childhood handwritings. When the light is right, the graphite shines. I set the table for Sunday lunch, blue checked cloth, mismatched plates with the fainting gold rims, a milk glass bud vase that flatters supermarket flowers. Chamomile and baby's breath made the room look braver than it was. The oven turned the kitchen warm and forgiving. I basted a chicken with butter and rosemary, tucking lemon into its hollow the way my mother did. At 12:30, the front door opened without a knock. Nora came first, her hair tidy, her camel-colored dress behaving as if it had instructions. Derek followed with his phone in his hand, thumbs skittering. He dropped into Walter's chair, my husband's favorite, and thumbed the remote. The television answered in a polite murmur. Neither of them noticed the flowers. Nora brushed my cheek with her lips, but kept her eyes flighty as if they were birds trained not to land. She perched on the edge of a dining chair and pressed her knees together. "Mom," she said in a voice that belonged to a meeting I wasn't invited to, "we need to talk." I set the carving board beside the stove and turned off the oven to let the meat rest. "Talk then. The house is too much for you," she began. "Too many rooms, too many stairs. You'd be happier with people on your schedule." The phrase arrived fully packaged, like something you buy in a bundle and never open. Derek didn't look up from his screen. "It's a safety issue," he said. He said it again slower, as if repetition could make a noun into law. Safety. I slid the chicken onto the board and picked up the carving fork. My hands knew what to do even as my breath stumbled. "This is my home," I said. A room I could navigate, blindfolded, tilted a degree the way it does when you realize the photograph you love has been hanging slightly crooked and no one mentioned it. Nora gave me a smile so thin it might have been cut with a knife. "We've already looked into options," she said. "It will be easier for everyone." The clock by the doorway ticked loudly, 1 syllable harder than the rest. On Thursday, a cold edge bit into the air, the kind of metallic chill that makes the desert smell like iron filings. I had just folded the last of the towels when the knock came sharp, hurried. I was halfway down the hall when the front door opened anyway. Derek stepped in with a man in a slate suit whose clipboard had a holster for a tape measure. "This is the appraiser," Derek announced, bright with authority, the way people sound when they practice in the car. The man cut a path through the living room, his shoulder brushing a frame that holds Nora at 8, gap-toothed, grinning, beside a goldfish she named Prince. He tapped on walls like a doctor impatient with his patient. "Roof's old," he said. "Laundry's not to code." He muttered about plumbing and tile, and he wrote numbers in a marginalized scribble. I stood by the window and held the curtain I had crocheted on a summer when Walter insisted we couldn't afford air conditioning, and felt myself become something that could be stepped around. Nora trailed them, nodding politely at the man's criticisms, agreeing that the kitchen was dated, that the bathrooms needed modern fixtures. The words had a professional gloss, as if they'd been buffed. When the appraiser left the house, exhaled, then I realized it was me. That evening, Nora came back alone with a neat stack of brochures, glossy enough to show my face, when the lamp hit them. Sage Pine Sunrise Ridge Nanims, meant to sound like poems. Smiling people held cards under fluorescent lights, as if contentment could be dealt. "They have bingo nights," she offered, almost cheerful. She set the papers on the dining table where Walter and I once argued about whether we were the kind of people who needed matching napkin rings. The brochures fanned outward as if trying to cover the wood. "I'm not leaving," I said. "This is my address. It's also my name." Her mouth tightened. Derek says you left the stove on last week. You could have burned the block down. The lie slid into the room and tried to make itself comfortable. I stared at it, then at her. She wouldn't hold my gaze. No, I said, I didn't. In the morning, Derek returned with another man, this one carrying a leather portfolio and the smell of cologne that insists on attention. Mr. Bellamy, he said, our attorney. He spread papers across my dining table, deeds, affidavits, words that wore suits. The legal language ran in neat columns that looked like floors in a building where I did not live. Mrs. Hart, the lawyer, said in a voice designed to be soothing, "If you sign here, the transfer of title will be straightforward." Transfer, I repeated. The syllables felt like a step I hadn't seen in the dark. This is my home. Derek leaned forward and his eyes, which often look like they're thinking 2 steps ahead, sharpened. You're not making sound decisions anymore, he said. Nora is your heir and she's taking responsibility. It's in your best interest. The lawyer coughed like a punctuation mark. If you resist, we will have to consider a capacity petition, he added almost delicately, as if the phrase were a feather and not a hammer. The daisies no chamomile had begun to bend in their vase, the small white wheels suddenly shy. A heat rose in my chest that felt like shame and anger braided. I pressed my palm flat against the cloth to feel the table, the wood we scraped and stained with our hands, the wood that remembers. I need time, I said. 1 week, Derek answered. The words had a click to them like a lock finding its home. After that, we'll do what needs to be done. They left with their papers. The front door closed hard enough to rattle the skinny window beside it. I stood in the quiet house, a quiet I had always trusted to be gentle, and found that it now had edges. In the living room, Walter's chair looked like a question no one wanted to answer. I sat. The cushion sighed. I gripped the armrest the way you grip a railing on a moving train and let the tears come. Not politely, not in a way I could mop with the corner of my sleeve. The sound of them surprised me, the shape of grief widened by insult. The clock in the hallway ticked and ticked as if it had been hired to keep me company. When the storm in me thinned, the house appeared again in its ordinary clothes. The kitchen wanted sweeping. The sink wanted rinsing. The plants needed to be turned toward the light. I did each thing as if the act could keep the walls from inching in. The chamomile drooped further, impossibly tender. I changed their water and told them to sit up straight. They didn't. I set Walter's mug in the dish rack to dry and laid the blue checked cloth over the back of a chair to air. 1 week, the air said. 1 week. I wiped the table slow circles with a damp towel, then dry, and the grain lifted under my hand like a map I should have learned earlier. The sun slid across the floorboards and found the same bright place it finds every afternoon. Outside, a neighbor's screen door snapped and a bicycle bell chimed twice. The neighborhood resumed its oblivious errands. In the bookshelf, the crooked shelf held as it always has. Walter would have tapped it and said, if it stands, it's standing. I stayed in his chair until the light peeled away from the wall and left the room undecided between day and night. Then I rose, washed my face, and made myself a cup of tea that I held until the heat left it. At the pantry door, my eye caught the penciled ladder Shafiv. Nora 8. Nora 10. Each mark a small argument against time. I touched one with my finger, felt the faint ridge. The house had been witness, record, accomplice. It was also resolutely mine. I turned off the lights one by one and let the quiet return to its original size. The quiet held through the night like a sheet tucked tight at the corners. I slept in pieces and woke in the seam between them, the clock's second hand, writing small circles in the dark. The house had its usual sounds, the expansion tick in the hallway, the breath of the refrigerator, but each felt sharpened as if the day had left a burr on everything it touched. I made tea, let it go cold, and carried the cup from room to room until it warmed only my palm. When I ran out of places to stand, I sat at Walter's desk. The top drawer opened with its old wooden sigh. Rubber bands fossilized into brittle moons. Postcards from a summer we spent meaning to see Lake Tahoe and never got further than Bowers Mansion. A roll of dimes. Receipts with ink that had faded to the color of rain. I lined them up because order calms me, because moving my hands lets my thoughts move without running. The middle drawer was worse. Thumbtacks loose like confetti, a carpenter's pencil worn to a stub, a booklet of voter registration forms we no longer needed. In the back, my finger knocked against something that wasn't wood. A flat folder manila gone amber with time banded by a brass hasp, too deliberate to be an accident. Walter never locked things. He hid gifts in plain sight the way some people hide laughter in a straight face. I checked the obvious places, pen cup tape dispenser, the blue ceramic dish that still held 2 cufflinks, and a paperclip shaped like a heart from Nora's second-grade art fair. No key. The bottom drawer stuck, then released the way old drawers do, with a sound like a polite complaint. Envelopes, a mini flashlight that didn't light a book, whose spine I recognized by touch. Desert gardening through the year. I lifted it and something rattled. In the gutter of the binding, a tiny key was taped under a band of yellowing Scotch tape, the ends turned down neatly as if someone meant the finder to succeed rather than struggle. The key fit the brass hasp with a click so small it barely disturbed the air. Inside the folder, papers lay in a tidy sequence. The first page bore my name, Evelyn Margaret Hart, in Walter's careful block letters. A last will and testament dated 6 months before the hospital winter we tried not to name. I read every line, lips moving without sound. He'd left everything to me, not as a flourish, but as a literal clause unadorned as his breakfasts. One paragraph paused at our daughter's name. Nora Hart, beneficiary contingent upon care, rendered in affection and respect to the testator's spouse. The phrasing was lawyerly and exact, but I could hear him in it love and respect, not just errands and holidays. Behind the will lay deeds. A 6-unit court of apartments off Prater Way in Sparks ours. A small mixed-use storefront on Victorian Avenue ours. A tidy courtyard building in Carson City with lemon trees sketched in the margin by Walter's hand ours. Each recorded, each free of liens. I turned pages by their corners. Bank statements that climbed instead of fell. Stock certificates in a Reno-based geothermal firm whose name I'd only skimmed in the local paper. Dividends modest but relentless. Nothing glittered. Everything held. At the bottom of the folder waited an envelope with my name written the way he wrote it on grocery lists, as if even onions and soap required tenderness. Evie. He always shortened me the way tailors take in a hem, precisely so I fit. I slid a finger under the flap and unfolded a single page. The letter wasn't long. Walter apologized without drama for keeping finances quiet. I wanted your rest, not your worry. He wrote that he trusted me to decide and that safeguards were in place not to trap, but to shelter. Then, in a line that made the skin at my throat go tight, he wrote, I don't like how Derek looks at the world when it stands between him and his own reflection. He didn't accuse. He observed the way he checked weather before we drove the pass. And at the end, if you ever need what I've built, use it with a steady hand. I read it again. The words didn't grow larger, they grew true. Grief rose and didn't knock, came and sat, took off its coat. I let it. I had been bracing myself against emptiness. Here was structure. The room looked the same, but the air had shifted its weight from one foot to the other. I put the letter back in its envelope, and the envelope back in the folder. On the desk, I made a stack will deed statements. Then a smaller stack of copies from the machine, Walter once joked, was smarter than both of us on bad days. I slid the originals into a zippered pouch and set the pouch in the bottom drawer under the gardening book, as if returning a seed to soil. The brass key I did not retape. I put it on a string and looped it around my neck. It felt light. It felt exact. Night thin toward morning. Through the kitchen window, the ridge above the valley softened. I washed the mug, dried it, and placed it upside down on the rack. The blue checked cloth still hung on the chair. I smoothed it with my palm until the creases grew honest instead of hasty. In the pantry, the pencil marks listed our girl against time. I added nothing to them. I didn't need to. The house breathed with me, not calmer, not louder, simply with. When the kettle sang, I turned off the flame before it whistled. On the desk, the papers waited in their new shape. I set a small paperweight on top Walter's agate, the one that looks like a storm caught mid-sky, and opened the blinds to let the day take its own size. Monday began with a wind that lifted grit from the street and sketched pale arcs across the porch. I had been awake since before the light broke open. The papers lay squared on Walter's desk under his agate paperweight, and the small brass key cooled against my skin where the string rested at the collarbone. The kettle hummed, then quieted. I drank half a cup, set it down, and wiped a ring from the table with the heel of my hand. At 9, a low engine idled in the driveway, heavy as a cough. Doors slammed. Bootsteps crossed the planks of the porch with a confidence I recognized men paid by the hour, hired to lift what doesn't want to be lifted. I stood in the arch between kitchen and living room and let the house steady around me, the crooked shelf, the old piano bench, the frame with Nora and the goldfish. Derek came first, shoulder squared as if broadness could substitute for permission. His shirt was the color of wet pavement, his jaw sanded close. Behind him, Nora stepped inside with one hand at her middle, not quite touching, as if to reassure something small and new, that all noise could be explained. 2 men in matching work shirts hovered behind them, their palms open, their eyes polite. "Mom, why are you just standing there?" Nora asked. Her tone reached for brisk and landed near brittle. "We need to start." Derek didn't wait for an answer. Bedroom first, he told the movers. Closets, then the china. Pack what matters before the rest. He had already crossed to Walter's chair as if it were a general's marker on a map, claimed not by sitting, but by proximity. "No one moves a single thing," I said, and my voice surprised me by sounding like I'd had time to practice it. This house and what surrounds it belongs to me. Derek's laugh was short and bright, a glass hit with a spoon. To you, on a pension and a forgotten address. I crossed to the desk, picked up the top sheet, and set it on the table. The 6-unit court off Prater Way in Sparks, I said, with the care of a librarian reading call numbers. The mixed-use storefront on Victorian Avenue. The courtyard building in Carson City with the lemon trees. The deeds are recorded. The rents have been paid, including yours. His attention snagged on the word involuntary yours. He snatched the page and scanned it, mouth-tightening, eyes flicking to the seal and back. Fabricated, he said too quickly. A good printer, a bad lie. You're welcome to call the county recorder, I replied. Or Ms. Ames at Hollings & Ames, who confirms the record. I let the small weight of the agate sit where it was and slid a shorter stack forward photocopies with their faint gray shadows of staple holes. But before you do the checks you've sent for the past 3 years, every one of them were processed by the management company and deposited into an account I can show you. You've been very punctual. One of the movers coughed into his fist. The other looked at a point somewhere above the television as if the ceiling had become informative. Nora's face had gone pale under the neat foundation. Mom, she said softly, like a hand reaching across a table and stopping halfway. How long have you known? Since yesterday became today, I said. Walter left order where I thought we had only thrift. Derek's fingers trembled barely. He set the page down as if paper could drop a distance. None of this changes the question of capacity, he said, finding a tone professional, unsympathetic. You're not making sound choices. We're acting in your best interest. Acting, I said. Yes. I looked at the movers. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. There will be no packing here. They shifted in the doorway like men who understand contracts and also understand blood. The older one cleared his throat. Ma'am, we don't want trouble. Nor do I said. Which is why you won't cross that threshold with a single box. Derek's color deepened. He set his hands on the table and leaned in. You're interfering in your own welfare, he said. Do you hear yourself? Do you hear how absurd that sounds? Nora flinched. The hand she'd kept at her middle rose and stayed. Mom, she blurted, and the word broke open like something spilled. I'm pregnant. She said it as if it had been a key she'd held too long in her fist, and it had warmed to her shape. Do you want your grandchild sleeping in a car while you? She stopped herself, swallowed. Please. The room didn't change size, but the air shifted. I wanted to step forward to touch her cheek, to let awe do what awe does, but the timing came as a tool sharpened, aimed. I found Walter's chair with my palm and steadied. Congratulations, I said, and meant it. A child deserves rooms without fear in them. None of those rooms are created by threatening a grandmother in her house. Derek's jaw flickered. Enough, he said flat. He turned to the movers again, voice edged. Bedroom, now. Sir, the older mover said carefully. With respect, the owner says no. I am the son-in-law, Derek snapped. That's not ownership, the younger replied before he could stop himself. He glanced at me as if apology could be dispatched by eye contact. Nora's gaze traveled from the deeds to Derek, to me, and back again, as if looking could align everyone into something less jagged. Derek, she said softly, urgent. Maybe we should leave. I finished for her. Please. I did not raise my voice. I didn't need to. The men in work shirts backed out first, polite to a fault, promising to waive half their fee because they hadn't lifted a finger. Derek waited long enough to look around to memorize inventory. He swallowed as if something large and bitter had lodged where words begin. You won't keep this up, he said, and then he was gone. The front door closed with a complaint. The house settled a boat riding out the wake of another craft. The quiet afterward was not gentle. It had burrs. I righted a stack of magazines I hadn't noticed he'd knocked with his elbow. I returned the deeds to their second position in the stack, the letters beneath the weight of agate. On the counter, the kettle waited to be filled again. I filled it. Water always asks to become steam. I have learned to let it. By afternoon, the wind had dropped. The day unfolded its usual errands: a neighbor's mailman, a child's bicycle bell, paper flutter at the end of the block where someone had taped a yard sale sign to a post. I thought to call Nora, then thought not to. A call would be a net. I did neither. I wiped the counters. I turned the jade plants half an inch toward the light. The phone rang just before evening, the old bell insisting on itself. Mrs. Hart, a man asked, voice thin with nerves. This is Luis at the courtyard building in Carson City. Well, there's a situation. A tenant is here insisting the owner cheated him, that his rent is a scam. He's shouting he wants the owner now. I didn't want to call you, but is the tenant named Derek Green, I asked. A pause. Yes, I'm on my way, I said. Coat keys, leather shoes that remember miles. The sky over the pass had already started the process of evening. At the edge of town, wind ran its comb through the sage and left lines. The drive was muscle memory. Walter and I had done it so many times that the motion itself was a kind of company In the shadowed pockets, the air smelled like tin and dust. The courtyard building sat low and steady behind a small wrought iron gate. No one had watered the lemon trees that week. Their leaves cupped dust. Through the glass door, I could hear Derek's voice. It wasn't loud in volume, it was loud in insistence, a blade put to a whetstone. "That old woman is lying," he said as I entered, and since he was gesturing at Louise, the sentence fell neatly into the room like a card on a table. Tenants lingered in doorways because human beings will always attend a public story. A woman with a mail key waited, not pretending disinterest. "Good evening, Mr. Green," I said. "You asked for the owner." He spun color high in his face. "You," he said. "You don't own anything. You forged." He searched for a word that could contain the insult he needed. This entire performance. I set my purse on the counter, opened it, and pressed the speaker icon on my phone. "Victoria," I said. A calm contralto answered. "I'm here." "This is Victoria Ames," I said for the room. "Attorney at Hollings and Ames." "Mrs. Hart," the voice continued professional without being cold. "As we discussed, I've pulled records. The Hart's Carson Court is held free and clear in your name. The Prater Way Court and the Victorian Avenue storefront as well. All rents administered under the management agreement you signed 9 years ago. The record shows Mr. Green's unit paid through the end of last month. Do you need me to read parcel numbers into the phone? I can." "No," I said. "Thank you." Derek's mouth opened, then closed. He redirected to the audience. "She's manipulating everyone," he told the tenants. "She's bending my wife against her own blood. Your wife's blood is her own." I said too quietly for drama exactly loud enough to register. "As is mine." The woman with the mail key lifted her eyebrows, but volunteered nothing. A young man in a sweatshirt looked at his shoes, then at Derek, then at me as if there might be extra credit for choosing a side. "If Mr. Green has a maintenance request," Louise said carefully, "he can submit it tomorrow during office hours. If he has a legal complaint, he can pursue it legally. For now, we're closed." Derek stared at me long enough that the air between us almost had texture. He was a man who could talk anyone into a different angle, if not a different truth. He had found an angle that met a wall. He put both palms on the counter and leaned forward, a man, making a point at a poker game only to discover the bet was counted in a currency he didn't own. "This is not finished," he said, and the words were not a threat so much as a refusal to translate. He turned on his heel and walked out too fast to be called a stride. The glass door hissed shut behind him, and the room released a breath none of us had coordinated. Luis rubbed his forehead. "I'm sorry," he said as if apologies were his to make. "I didn't know what to—" "You called me," I said. That was sufficient. The tenants drifted back into their doorways, their kitchens, their evenings. Small ordinary sounds resumed, a cabinet closed. Water ran. A television recommenced its low conversation with the air. I stepped into the courtyard. The lemons were still green under dust, small suns before the ignition. I pinched a leaf and felt the grit on my fingers. Walter had sketched these trees in the margin of a deed. He had drawn them like proof. On the drive home, the valley accepted night without persuasion. I let the radio be silent. My hands remembered the way the wheel feels when you're not squeezing. The leather answers the same whether or not you're afraid. Nora was at my kitchen table when I returned, her face washed of whatever the day could paint there. A mug of tea sat cooling in both her hands. The chamomile had let go of most of its yellow to the water. She looked up and her eyes were not someone else's. "Mom," she said. The word was old and new at once. I hung my coat, set my keys in the ceramic dish, and waited. Silence is a tool I respect. It opens spaces speech can't. She took a breath that seemed to rewire her sternum. "Derek has been deciding me for years." She said, the sentence landing without drama. At first it was easy to call it care. He wanted to know when I'd be home, which friends made me scatter, how I was using my time. He wanted receipts, he wanted calendars. He wanted me to call before I called you. The tea steamed into the air like a small weather. She watched it as if it might provide an answer and then kept going. When I took the job at Sequoia Insurance, he lasted 2 months before he started saying, "It made me look cheap to work behind a counter." He said a wife with a husband who would someday be a partner shouldn't smell like printer toner. He called the stipend he gave me household alignment and told me it was generous. He asked for proof of anything I bought beyond groceries. He laughed when I cried. He laughed like I was auditioning poorly. I didn't reach for her hand. I let the space remain the size she could cross on her own. "He made me block you on social media for a while." She said it with a flinch, a word-level wince. "He said you were encouraging me to be sentimental and small. He told me your house was dangerous. He used the word safety like it could close any door. When we came with the appraiser, I told myself you'd be happier in a place with corridors and a nurse whose shoes squeaked. I used his words because they let me not use mine." Her shoulders shook once, then went still as if the tremor had been a language the rest of her didn't speak. "I'm sorry," she said. I can catalog the steps I took for myself to here, but the list doesn't add up to an apology you deserve. I stood in your doorway and let a stranger price your rooms. I set brochures on your table. I brought a man to your house to say you were unfit to decide your own coffee. You're here, I said. The interruption was soft because it had to be. You're here now. She swallowed. Derek says you've made me choose, and that means you've already lost. He says I won't survive without him. He says you're... She swallowed again as if the word had edges. Manipulating me. Words have weight even when they are false. They leave fingerprints when they're lifted. I watched the steam thin from her cup. The kettle on the stove reflected a small bent version of the room. Read this, I said, and slid Walter's letter across the table. I had thought I might never show it to anyone whose body did not end where mine began. But it had been written in a voice that had always included the three of us, even when only two were listening. She unfolded the page with the care you give to what you're afraid might be fragile. Her eyes moved. They moved again. Tears blurred, cleared, returned. At the line about how Derek regards the world, something in her face stilled not the erasure that comes with surrender, but the steadiness you see in a person locating a footing they had forgotten was there. When she finished, she touched the paper with her fingertips as if it had heat. He knew, she whispered. It wasn't a question and it wasn't a revelation. It was a meeting point between a man's caution and a daughter's denial. He saw through him and loved us anyway. I nodded. There was nothing to add that wouldn't subtract. Nora set the letter down and pressed both palms to the tablecloth as if to steady it, as if the table might be a boat. I don't know how to step from where I am to anywhere else, she said, voice steadier than the content. I don't know how to explain to a person like Derek that no is a sentence. You don't have to explain, I said. You only have to say it. She looked at me the way you look at a map, not for romance, but for direction. At the pantry door, the ladder of pencil marks waited a record that had refused to anticipate this moment and therefore was available to it. The house hummed with its small domestic weather. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and gave up. Nora wiped her eyes with the backs of her fingers. May I stay here tonight? She asked. Not the crowding request of a person fleeing, but the composed one of a person choosing where to set her body. Yes, I said. Your room is where you left it. In her old doorway, she paused and looked at the poster still thumbtacked behind the door from a college summer, the Smiths, curling at the corners, rent by time. You kept this, she said, half a laugh. I keep what keeps, I answered. She smiled, and it wasn't performance. It was simply what a face does when it's allowed to participate in relief. She disappeared into the room. I heard drawers open, then close softly. The house adjusted to another heartbeat. I washed 2 mugs and set them in the rack to dry. The agate on the desk threw back a small private shine. Later, we sat together in the living room without talking, the television off the window open to the quiet. The night had chosen the darker version of itself and was content. Nora's hand drifted to her middle this time, not as defense, not as barter, but like someone listening for a sound from a room she had built herself and was learning to walk through. I turned Walter's chair a fraction toward hers, so our angles met and the crooked shelf held. Morning arranged itself carefully around the house, as if not to wake anyone before it had to. I stood in the kitchen and watched the ridge take back its color. In the hallway, Nora's door was half closed the way she used to leave it as a teenager, a signal that said, I'm here, but not yet. The kettle ticked on the stove before it chose to sing. I turned off the flame ahead of the whistle and poured hot water over a tea bag with a patience that felt borrowed from someone sturdier. Nora came out in Walter's old sweatshirt sleeves pushed to her elbows, hair braided without art. She held her mug with both hands and leaned against the counter like the tile could carry some of her weight. Did you sleep? I asked. Enough, she said. I dreamed I was back in my dorm and couldn't remember the code to get into the building. I stood outside and listened to the buzz of other people's lives. Codes change, I said, and let it end there. Her phone lit with messages she did not open. The bubbles stacked as if they could build a wall strong enough to hurt us. She set the phone face down and watched the steam. By late morning, we were at Hollings and Ames, the glass door reflecting Juniper Lane's narrow sky. Victoria Ames had the steady expression of someone who knows how to move forward without dragging. She listened more than she spoke and filled the quiet with paper that mattered. Ms. Hart, she said to Nora, I've filed for a temporary protective order. We'll ask for no contact pending a full hearing. We'll also request exclusive possession of the Juniper Lane residence for your mother while the title dispute resolves. For custody, we'll seek temporary orders. Not because a judge needs to decide your life, but because he's trying to make one without you. Nora nodded and signed where tabs sprouted. Victoria never hurried a pen. She waited until a hand found its own pace. She slid a second stack toward me. Mrs. Hart, the capacity insinuations are strategy. We'll preempt evaluation from Dr. Vieira at the clinic, documented and boring. Boring helps. I looked at the blue sticky flags and felt the small courage of competent paper. We left with folders and a date. The hearing drew closer the way weather does not. Dramatic at first, just different light. I kept the routines that keep a day from crumbling sweep-fold water. Nora stayed in her old room, collected what she'd left of herself, and called the insurance office to ask about work, her voice steadier each time she said her own name into a phone. When Derek called, the protective order held. When he sent emails, Victoria documented them. When he left a note on Nora's car, the officer who took the report was kind and specific. The morning of court broke clean and dry. In town, the courthouse lifted its pale stone into a sky that meant business. Inside, we moved through metal detectors, through the soft coughs of benches that have hosted grief and relief in equal measure. The bailiff announced the case, and the room narrowed to edges and center. Derek sat at the opposite table in a suit that fit him the way ambition does when it stops pretending to be polite. His attorney, a man whose tie could have been used to flag planes on a runway, arranged his notes into angles. Victoria's files made clean stacks. She set Walter's letter aside not because it wasn't important, but because she understood which truths belonged to paper and which to people. Judge Helen Ruiz took the bench. She had a face that looked like it had learned patience the long way, a presence that said the room existed to do a job rather than perform one. Derek's attorney began. He used phrases that sounded expensive. Manipulation, elder vulnerability, asset control. He described me as a widow collapsed into sentiment, operating through grief to engineer leverage. He painted Nora as a frightened, unstable woman swayed by a parent who could not allow her to build a separate life. He said the word safety as if the syllables were a contract already signed. Victoria stood without theatricality. She did not correct his adjectives. She replaced them with nouns. Exhibits A through F. A series of text messages from Derek to Nora requesting itemized receipts for clothes, toothpaste, birthday gifts. A recording of an argument in which he used love like a leash. The management ledger from Carson Court showing rent from Unit 3B Derek's processed through the company and deposited to my account. A certified copy of the deeds for Prater Way, Victorian Avenue and Carson. Bank statements that climbed predictably with columns even a librarian's eye could love, Luis testified. He stood at the witness stand with the caution of a man who knows the weight of other people's homes. He told the court exactly what he had seen and heard, not more and not less. He did not look at Derek when he said "you shouted," as if the word could aim itself. Neighbors spoke. Mrs. Kim from 2 doors down described the day the appraiser knocked and did not wait. Mr. Wrighton from across the street explained how he'd helped us adjust the porch light last winter and how we hadn't needed the ladder more than once. The officer who took the protective order report walked through his notes. His memory had the square corners of a notebook. Dr. Vieira testified briefly, memory intact, orientation sound, judgment unimpaired. He used the phrase, no clinical indication of incapacity. It sat on the record like a steel chair. When it was my turn, Victoria asked only what mattered. The house. The routines that keep it. Walter's habit of drawing lemon trees in margins. How a crooked shelf can hold more than its shape implies. I answered in the narrow way court requires and kept the rest. The warmth of the blue checked cloth after it comes off the line. The sound of Nora laughing into a pillow when she was 10 where it belongs. Nora took the stand last. She didn't tell a saga. She laid a path. He asked me to quit my job. He controlled our money. He used the word safety to win arguments I wasn't allowed to have. She described the morning in our kitchen, the brochures the lawyer's portfolio set down like a permanent object. When Derek's attorney asked whether she understood the gravity of accusing her husband of coercion, she said yes, without catching on the word husband. Cross-examination came and went like weather predicted and unremarkable. Victoria declined to redirect. She knew when enough is enough. The closing arguments gathered the same facts and tried to dress them differently. Judge Ruiz listened with the kind of attention that doesn't nod or frown. She wrote notes as sparingly as if ink cost a day of her life. When she spoke, her sentences sat squarely on their feet. Title to the property stands on recorded deeds and is not presently contested on any valid ground, she said, looking down once at the copies. Temporary exclusive possession of the Juniper Lane residence remains with Mrs. Hart. The court issues a no-contact order prohibiting Mr. Green from contacting either Ms. Hart or Mrs. Hart pending further proceedings. Temporary custody orders Ms. Hart has primary physical custody. Mr. Green has no visitation until further review conditioned on counseling and compliance with the order. Fees and limited damages awarded to Mrs. Hart for the expense of defending against the capacity claim which this court finds unsupported. The gavel stayed in its cradle. She didn't need it. Derek made a sound not large enough to be called a shout, but too sharp to be conversational. His attorney put a hand on his sleeve and spoke into the fold of his shoulder. Papers were shuffled and the air returned to civilian pressure. Outside, the sky had not commented. We left the courthouse through the same doors we entered. Nora's hand found my forearm as we descended the steps, not to be guided, but so the two of us could agree about gravity. Victoria walked with us to the sidewalk, gave us both the kind of hug professionals give when they mean it and need to keep their edges, and said she'd be in touch before the order ink dried. She meant it. In the weeks that followed, the house resumed its narrow weather. I changed the bulbs in the porch light. I stitched a tear in the blue-checked cloth and pressed the seam with the iron Walter forgot in the laundry room 6 summers ago. Nora returned to Sequoia Insurance part-time, then full. She packed carefully and moved what she wanted from her apartment with 2 friends from the office. The movers we hired moved only what we pointed to and no more. The pantry ladder of pencil marks remained exactly the same, a private archive in a world that craves announcements. The baby came in late spring when the lilac at the corner fence could be smelled from the sidewalk, even by strangers. Nora named her June, a word that carries its own light. She arrived with a full head of dark hair and a stubborn, efficient cry. In photos, she looks like herself, rather than a collage of our features. I cleared a low shelf for diapers and the kind of gentle soap that announces itself by not smelling like anything at all. The crooked shelf still held. Walter's chair had a tiny blanket folded over its arm knit by Mrs. Kim without permission. Summer flattened the grass and made the lemons shine at Carson Court. Louise sent a photo. The courtyard looked like a postcard from a place that expects you to miss it when you leave. The rent ledger remained regular. Derek's unit now had a tenant named R. Salgado, who paid on the 1st with a note that said thank you for fixing the swamp cooler. We fixed the swamp cooler because it needed fixing. The things that needed doing got done because that is how homes behave when they're treated like nouns rather than trophies. By autumn, a file folder lived on the bookshelf beside the piano bench. Inside it were resource pages I'd asked Victoria to draft: how to request a protective order, how to read a deed, how to find a reputable counselor without first knowing the word reputable. I took the folder to the Washoe County Library on Wednesdays and sat in the bright back room where the afternoon sun lands square on the table. They called it a clinic, though I dislike that word for anything that gives rather than extracts. People came with questions folded small in their pockets. Most of the time, handing over a phone number and a list of steps was enough to help the day stand back up. Sometimes all that changed was the direction someone faced while they breathed. That qualified. We decided against a name with the word foundation. We called it Juniper Table because it started at mine because there was tea, because people set their hands down and could feel wood. No plaque, no gala. Just Wednesdays and paper that does what paper can do. On weeks when the courthouse docket ran over, Victoria sent a young associate named Maya, who had an excellent laugh and a better filing system than mine. Maya never spoke like she needed to impress the air. The library staff left a plate of shortbread that vanished in the exact portion you'd expect from people learning about the price of ink. One afternoon in winter, Judge Ruiz stopped at the table on her way to a continuing education panel downstairs. She wore her coat open and her hair pinned back in a way that said she hadn't thought about it. "Mrs. Hart," she said, extending her hand. "No bench today, just stairs to climb." She looked at the copies laid out. Deeds, a template affidavit, a list of clinics with sliding scales. "Good paper," she said. "It helps." "It does," I said. She nodded once and left the kind of exit that doesn't need to prove itself by leaving hard. Evenings at home found their old shape without imitating it. The blue check cloth made a square that fit the table because the table had been sanded by people who loved it. The jade plants kept their modest reach toward the window. On the pantry door, the pencil ladder gained a new mark. June, 6 months a line low and stubborn a beginning, allowed to be small. Sometimes Nora came late from the office and set a bag of groceries on the counter with the grace of someone glad to carry something ordinary. We ate what hadn't needed a recipe. We watched the local news for weather and school board votes. We didn't talk about Derek unless there was a reason. Silence can be honest work when it respects the facts. On Sunday afternoons, June learned the acoustics of the living room by experimenting with squeals. She studied the agate paperweight as if it contained a story she could fit in her mouth. I moved it higher and handed her a wooden spoon. The crooked shelf held mugs that did not match and never needed to. When June napped, Nora sometimes sat at Walter's desk and sorted mail with the stern responsibility of a small-town clerk. She paid the utilities online with a flourish, then looked satisfied. People are allowed to be pleased by their competence. The first time June pulled herself upright on the edge of the pantry door frame, her hand found the pencil mark that reads Nora 8. She tapped it the way you tap a window to see if it will answer. The house answered with floor creaks and kettle ticks and the faint chatter of leaves outside whenever the wind remembered us. I had never noticed that this corner is where listening collects. At night, after dishes, I turn off the lights one by one and leave the last switch to the hallway so the pantry door is lit for a beat longer than the rest. In that interval, the graphite shines as if reflecting something living. I straighten the blue checked cloth and set Walter's mug near the dish rack, mouth down. The agate on the desk keeps its small private weather. The key on the string at my neck rests where it has learned to rest. The house takes a breath, and I take one with it. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.